Hello, and welcome to this lecture on markets. In this lecture, I'm going to describe the four basic market types. In Principles of Microeconomics, you would have learned about perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. Perfect competition is the most competitive market, and as we move down this list, we get to the least competitive market, which is the monopoly. Now, when we're defining markets, we can essentially define them based on 6 criteria that we see here. Most markets have enforced property rights and contract law. This is actually a requirement for any market to function. We can talk about how easy it is to enter and exit a market. Is the product standardized? Do we see an identical product or nearly identical product? Or are the products in the market slightly different or very unique? How many consumers and producers are there in the market? And therefore, how much control does each of these have on the price in the market? We could also talk about how informed producers and consumers are. Do they have perfect information about the products and services available? Do they know everything about how a product is made? And do they know the substitutes that are there for competition? Are there externalities? Does participation in this market as a producer or as a consumer cause problems or benefits for other people? Well, when we're defining these markets, we generally don't worry about these last 2 items. This is something that you will look at if you get into a higher level course. But in the Principles course, this is something that is not examined very closely. We kind of say, let's forget about these for the time being. We're going to define our markets based on essentially these 4 criteria. And we'll just assume that the last 2 criteria actually do happen. So when we're looking at perfect competition, these are the types of goods that we would associate with a perfectly competitive market. Gold. Gold is gold. It does not matter where you purchase your gold from. It is exactly the same as gold from anywhere else. Fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables are essentially identical. You can go to a store and purchase bananas. You could go to another store and purchase bananas. There's really not much difference between the bananas that store A sells and the bananas that store B, or C, or D, or E sells. Wheat. Again, all wheat is essentially the same. It's fairly easy to get into these markets as well. There's a lot of fruit and vegetable stores. There are a lot of gold miners in the world. So essentially, everybody in these types of markets are price takers. Now, when we look at the criteria for a perfectly competitive market or perfect competition, we see that all of those criteria, all of those assumptions that were set out earlier in this lecture, are all being followed. Of course, we have enforced property rights and contract law. That is required for any market to function. Firms, as well as customers, are free to enter and exit the market. If you want to go buy gold, you can go buy gold. You're free to do so. If you want to open up a vegetable store, you are also free to do so. Similarly, there are companies that might want to exit these markets, and they can do so quite easily. We just talked about the standardized product, so apples are apples. Apples are essentially the same everywhere you go. And because of these things, as well as the fact that there's many consumers and producers, the competition level is so high that there is no one who has control over the market price. So essentially, if you want to go buy an apple from one store, it's going to be the same price as an apple from another store. We would call these types of consumers and producers in this market price takers. That is, the market determines the price, and people who enter these markets simply take that price as given. Monopolistic competition. This is the most common market that we have in North America and in Europe and essentially anywhere in the world. Monopolistic competition is very similar to perfect competition with one big difference. The products that are sold are not identical. They can be very similar, but there can be variation. For example, restaurants. Restaurants often cook the same types of foods. Lots of restaurants serve sandwiches, but not all sandwiches are the same. Here we see a sandwich that has lettuce, tomato, roast beef, and it's served on a baguette style bread. But you can also get a roast beef sandwich that has coleslaw and horseradish sauce on it, served on a ciabatta bun, as well as many other different types of sandwiches. So they're similar, but they're not identical. And this gives, the sellers of these goods an opportunity to vary the price. So sometimes you'll go into a restaurant and the sandwich is $15, and other times you'll go into a restaurant and the sandwich is $10. Right? So there's going to be some variation in the price because there is differences in these products. They are similar but not identical. Same thing with clothing. Lots of different manufacturers of clothing, and not all pairs of jeans are the same. Right? So they have slightly different qualities. They have name brands, marketing associated with them, different fits. The manufacturers can vary the price a little bit. Cookware would be another example. There is cookware that is very high quality, can cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and there is cookware that is lower quality that can cost $10, $15, or $20. These will belong in monopolistic competition. The difference as we get to a less competitive environment is we're changing some of these rules or assumptions that we have for the market. Here we see that there is some variation amongst similar products. We still have many consumers and producers. However, because there is a little bit of variation in the actual product that is being sold, the producers have some control over the market price, as we stated with respect to sandwiches. A slightly less competitive market than what we just looked at would be the oligopoly. So oil and gas, the airplane or airline industry, and automobiles. An oligopoly literally means a few sellers. So there's not a lot of sellers within these markets. And because there's not a lot of sellers, these particular types of industries, the producers have quite a bit more control over the price. And sometimes they actually collude or work together to control the price. So what does an oligopoly look like when we look at our assumptions of the market? Well, first of all, there's not free entry and exit. You'll notice that a lot of these oligopoly markets have very high costs to entering. You can't just open up a car manufacturing plant or start an airline very easily. Right? It takes a lot of money up front in order to do this. So that is the biggest barrier to getting into these particular industries. The product is the same or different, so we don't know. When it comes to oil and gas, the product is virtually the same, no matter who is selling it. When it comes to airlines, the product is slightly different. So some airlines offer nicer perks than other airlines, right? So some airlines, you simply buy the ticket and you're on your own for the rest of the ride. You have to buy your own meal. You have to sit in a uncomfortable seat. Whereas other airlines offer, high quality transportation. They offer meals. The seats are made of leather or vinyl, so something a little bit more comfortable. So there's going to be some variation in the price, right? So a few producers will control the market price. And last would be the monopoly. Now, there's not really a lot of monopolies in the world, although there used to be monopolies. But some monopolies that we have are what we would call natural monopolies. And a natural monopoly is often one that is controlled by the government or run by the government. So things like the sewer system or the water works. The city of Vancouver essentially runs the sewer system. They also run the waterworks. There's only one producer for these particular goods. Same thing with the electric grid. If you're going to compete in the electric grid, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It is much more efficient for there to be only one producer putting up these towers that carry electricity everywhere. Google and Intel are close to being monopolies. However, they're not complete monopolies. I mean, a monopoly means one seller. And Google does have some competition, right? So they're not the only search engine out there, although they control about 90% of the market. Intel, as well, owns about 90% of the market for computer chips. So they're close to monopolies, however, they're not true monopolies, but they are fairly good examples within the competitive environment of firms. So what about the assumptions that we have for a monopoly market? Well, there's definitely no free entry and exit. Sometimes the entry and exit is protected, or at least the entry is protected by patents or copyrights. Right? So there's some sort of legal barrier to getting into that market. Other times it's just extremely high costs. The product, well, it's not really fair to talk about whether the product is standardized across the industry or is, differentiated. There's only one product in a monopoly, so this point doesn't really make sense. And of course, we only have one producer which would control the market price. So notice that as we moved from the most competitive to the least competitive market, we slowly took away some of these assumptions of how the market operates until we got to the monopoly, where essentially only one of these criteria is really met, that being the enforced property rights and contract law. So that's a brief overview of the different types of markets that you might encounter in the world. And in reality, there is a large range of markets and different types of market types in the world. And sometimes these markets are not what you would predict. For example, when it comes to agricultural goods, we actually see that a lot of the agricultural goods are controlled by oligopolies. Now, if we look at the types of products that are agricultural goods, our economic prediction would be that that should be perfect competition. However, in the real world, it is not. So, perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly are the basic markets of economics. So, thank you for attending this lecture. I hope you learned something. Take care, everybody.